In the year 1348, an event began in Britain that is estimated, at the very least, to have killed a third of the population. So, at the very least, this killed 1 out of every 3 people. Higher estimates put the figure at more like 2/3 of the population. Now, we don't know the exact figures because people at the time didn't keep very good records, and to be fair, even if they had, they probably wouldn't have done at a time like this. But it's possible that this killed up to 3.5 million people in Britain alone. And we are talking about the event that is known as the Black Death. Now, the Black Death is actually a Victorian name that was given to this. People at the time didn't call it that, but if you look at art and architecture and jewellery and other designs from about 150 years afterwards, you see a lot of skeletons and a lot of skulls because people became so used to living with the fear of death. And the Black Death is effectively an epidemic. That's a widespread occurrence of disease, of a disease that people at the time called plague. Now, we think that this was caused by a germ or a bacillus called Yersinia pestis. And it could attack the body in a variety of different ways. Now, the first way, and perhaps the most famous and well-known and common way, was through something called bubonic plague. And this would begin with the victim becoming very cold and tired. They would then develop big red lumps on their body, perhaps in their armpits, perhaps in their groin, perhaps in their neck. And these would be about the size of an apple or an egg. They're known as buboes. And they would be big and very painful. The victim would then develop a fever and awful headaches. They might develop a rash on other parts of their body. And death would come in about 5 days. Now, I have read that the death rate, that's the proportion of people who died from this kind of plague when they caught it, was between 30 and 75%. I'm not sure about this, firstly because it's so wide, it's not very meaningful, and secondly because I'm not sure how far it applies to the Black Death of 1348. But sometimes people did survive bubonic plague. Your best chance was if the bubo popped and it would release a sort of foul-smelling black pus, and then the person might have a chance of getting better. However, it is a bit like a spot. That would only happen if the bubo was ready. So maybe one of the ways that people tried to treat this was by getting the bubo ready to pop. That's one kind of plague. As far as we know, it was spread by fleas, and those fleas lived on rats, which of course can move quite freely between houses and also could travel on things like sailing ships. Now, it's believed that the flea carried the plague bacillus, Yersinia pestis, in its gut. And when a flea bites a person or an animal, it actually spits into the wound, or it spits into the bloodstream to thin the blood to make it easier to suck. So the idea is that the flea would spit the germ into the bloodstream whenever it bit a person or an animal and would spread the infection that way. This is commonly believed to be the cause of the Black Death. Historians have raised questions around this, however. For one thing, there were more deaths in winter during the Black Death, and if it really was spread by fleas and rats, you'd expect to see fewer deaths in winter because there would be fewer fleas and fewer rats when it was cold. The other problem is that archaeologists haven't really found very many rat skeletons when they've dug up medieval settlements. So, although this is commonly believed to be the cause of the Black Death, there are a few question marks around it. And if we don't know, these days, with our understanding of medical knowledge, people at the time certainly didn't. Now, there were other ways that the plague could attack people's bodies. One is through pneumonic plague. When you see pneu, it generally relates to air. So a pneumatic drill uses air to work. Pneumonia is a disease of the lungs, and the pneumonic plague was also when the plague got into people's lungs. And this would cause people to cough up blood. It also made them contagious because once they had pneumonic plague, the germ could be spread through droplets in their breath when they coughed and sneezed. So that was another impact of this. The death rate for pneumonic plague was 2 to 3 days, or the death time. That's how long it took to kill you. And the death rate was apparently 95%. It was higher than bubonic plague, and there was less chance of survival. So out of every 20 people who caught pneumonic plague, only one would be lucky enough to survive. Now, another way the plague could attack people was by getting into the blood. And so we call that septicemic plague. And that caused blood poisoning. It would make people bleed freely, and their fingers and toes, perhaps their nose, would turn black and begin to rot. That tended to cause death on the same day. Whoops. Here we go. It took 1 day to kill you, and it had a 100% death rate. There was no surviving septicemic plague. Now, it's believed that the plague originated in Asia, possibly China, and that it spread when rats hitched a lift on trade ships and sailing ships that were travelling around. This is a map of how it spread through Europe. You can see if the darker colours are where it occurred first, you can see that it was really spreading up north, perhaps this way, from the Mediterranean. So people in Britain were hearing rumours about a terrible disease in the south of Europe from about 1347. The sailing ship that brought the plague to Britain apparently landed in the summer of 1348 at the port of Melcombe in Dorset. And within a couple of weeks it had spread to London and Bristol. They say it travelled 500 miles in 500 days, so by December 1349 it had reached the very northerly tip of Britain, and it covered it. And it's almost impossible to imagine what this would have been like for people at the time. There are stories about whole villages being wiped out, so whole settlements of people that after this just didn't exist anymore because the plague killed them all. There are stories about people being buried in mass graves because there wasn't time to bury people individually. They ended up digging huge pits and tipping the bodies in and having one funeral for everybody. And there's also stories about priests running away because they were so frightened of having to look after the sick and pray with the sick and lead the funerals that some of them just tried to escape. So this is a really, really terrible event. And even after it's died down, which it does by about 1351, the plague then reoccurs sort of every 10 or 20 years. And there would be further smaller epidemics every 10 or 20 years afterwards. Apparently there were 20 outbreaks before the year 1500. So this is a disease that causes people a lot of problems, and those problems are really ongoing. Now, people at the time obviously didn't understand what was happening. They didn't know about germs, they didn't know about the fleas, they didn't know about the rats. And as a result, they came up with a number of explanations for the plague to try and explain what was happening to them and what was happening to the country at this time. Now, the first is based on the church's idea that sometimes God caused disease as a punishment for sin. So sometimes people believed that the plague was sent by God. And when you have an epidemic, if God sends disease to punish sin, an epidemic logically means that society has been sinning, society has been moving away from God. So people looked for all kinds of reasons for this. Apparently some of them believed that it was because people had too much money and they were showing off their wealth with fine clothes. That was one explanation. In other places, they stopped wrestling in graveyards by the church because they thought that that had offended God and made him send the plague. Another explanation was to do with the planets and the movement of the planets. So beliefs about astrology were sometimes used to explain the plague. A few years before it hit, there had been an occasion where 3 major planets, we've got Saturn, there it is with its rings, and Jupiter and Mars had all lined up together. So some people said that it was the conjunction, that's what it's called, of Jupiter, Saturn and Mars that had made the plague happen. So there were some supernatural explanations for the plague. There were, however, also some natural explanations for the plague. So some people believed that it was caused by an earthquake that happened in China in 1347. And they thought that that broke the earth open and caused the plague, the disease, to rise up from the ground. So that was one explanation. It kind of links in with another explanation, which was miasmas, or miasma, bad air. So people believed that the plague was caused by bad smells and that they carried the plague into the body through the nose. To be fair to them, if the plague was caused by rats, then rats would have been more likely to be attracted to rubbish and other smelly things. So there was possibly a link there that people noticed. People did have an idea that spending time around plague victims could lead to you catching the plague yourself, and in the case of pneumonic plague, this may have been true, but they didn't understand how, and some people believed that looking into the eye of a plague victim would make you catch the disease. So if they saw somebody with the plague or somebody who looked quite poorly, then they might refuse to look at them. Some people went so far as just to seal their doors and windows and to stay away from everybody because they believed that that would solve the problem. So contact with plague victims was seen as being a way of catching the plague. And then finally, people relied on their old explanations about the humours. The idea was that people whose humours were out of balance were more likely to catch the plague, and so they resorted to their old methods of trying to keep the humours in balance. And a lot of these ideas then impacted on the ways that people tried to prevent and cure the plague as well.